Welcome back. Well, it's almost 3 weeks now since the ban on international travel was lifted under level 1 of the lockdown. The government hopes that opening some of borders will promote more trade and tourism. Obviously, this has to happen within those level 1 lockdown regulations. But just how are things going now into the second week? Are travelers and officials adhering to the new norms and standards? Let's speak to the Minister of Home Affairs, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi. Minister, good morning and thank you very much for your time. Just an overriding question first up. It's almost 2 weeks since the 1st of October. How are things going since the borders have been open in your perspective?
Yeah, good morning, Dan, and good morning to the viewers and the listeners out there. Well, to tell you the truth, it's not really what we expected. We were expecting an avalanche of people now that the borders are open. But I can confirm that is not exactly like that. And I think the main reason is because our neighboring countries, especially Zimbabwe and Botswana, have not yet opened up. I'm sure you might have picked that up. That while we moved down to lock level 1, they were still at lock level 4. Botswana even announced that they are having a state of emergency. So for that reason, the only sort of traffic that has increased is trucking. And especially in Lebombo and Beitbridge, for the simple reason that you may remember that during the hard lockdown, trucks were finding it very difficult to go through Botswana, and they were diverted to Beitbridge and Lebombo, and they are still doing so. And that's part of our problem, why we've got lots and lots of trucks lining up there, because many of them are the ones who are supposed to have gone through Botswana.
Now, these countries you've mentioning, like Zimbabwe and Botswana, are at different levels of lockdown. Do you think there should have been better coordination as members of SADC?
Yeah, well, of course, then they should have been. But remember, throughout the whole world on this COVID-19, every country was doing what they think is best for them. So to go and force another country that were at this level, do this and do that, it was not easy because the disease was not hitting the countries at the same time and with equal intensity. So, for instance, you are aware that Zimbabwe picked up very, very late the COVID-19. They were regarding mainly as a South African problem. Now to go to them and say, look, in South Africa we are doing this, then you are forced to do that in alignment with us. It was something that was very difficult.
Yeah. Now, you've mentioned Lebombo border post. I drove to Mozambique the weekend. I left on Friday after having done my COVID-19 test. And my experience was a good one at the Lebombo border post on both sides, Lebombo and the Mozambican side, Rosano Garcia, very efficient and making sure that the COVID-19 test results I've got are official and are proper, and they're doing their work. But as you said, there's just trucks and very few travelers. In fact, at some point, my wife and I were the only people inside the immigration office to stamp our passports. There's hardly anybody. But there's a bit of a misunderstanding of the interpretation of that 72 hours. From where you sit in terms of the validity of the test for 72 hours, what does it actually mean? After you've crossed the border into a neighboring country, what happens? Because the Mozambican immigration officials, when we were coming back, took us to task, saying that we should have only stayed for 3 days, not more.
Well, thank you for raising that, Dan, and thank you for your wonderful experience. I'm wishing we can hear that most of the time from travelers, because that's basically our objective, that people must have a pleasant experience. Thank you for that. Yes, on this issue of 72 hours, the rule says it must not be older than 72 hours since your time of departure. That's what we have said. Subsequent to that, we realized that there are many people who cross many times. Like, as you said, then you went to Mozambique and back. Now you can imagine taking a test in South Africa and then go through the border. And when you arrive in Mozambique 2 days later, you are forced to take another test and come back. So we actually wrote to all the borders and told them, Once you do that 72-hour test, it's valid for 14 days. Then you can only repeat it after 14 days. In other words, for 14 days, you can cross the border with the same test result.
Okay, so that's the understanding from our side here in South Africa, but I must share this with you, Minister, and thank you very much for allowing us to do so, is that the Mozambican immigration officials understand it differently, and I'm hoping that there'll be more kind of conversations. I took it upon myself to speak to the head of South African Port Health at the Libombo when I was coming back to explain to them that they need to raise this with the Mozambican counterparts who seem to say it's 72 hours full stop and not 14 days. The wording that was used to me was that that's in South Africa. This is a different sovereign country. In Mozambique, it's not 14 days. So I guess there needs to be better interpretation and effort to coordinate the common understanding of that.
Yes, definitely. I'm surprised that they had to wait for you to tell them. The border managers are supposed to be friends and work in coordination with each other, because it doesn't help to have one side of the border open and only 100 meters away the other one is not working very well. It doesn't work that way. But I'm not sure why our port managers always wait for that. I remember on the 27th of March, the first day of the lockdown, when I went to Beit Bridge, it was chock-a-block. The trucks were lining up 10 kilometers into Musina, and the problem was mostly on the Zimbabwean side, even though there was a problem on South African side. But it was mostly on the Zimbabwean side. I asked them, let's cross over and sit there and talk to them. And we crossed, we sat on the Zimbabwean side. We spoke for about 30 minutes and everything started opening up. So it's just a question of managerial skills and leadership. And we are really calling on our port managers to show that managerial skill and leadership, you know.
Yeah, no, Minister, don't get me wrong. As I said, the system at the Libombo border post is efficient and works brilliant and professional, and the service delivered was amazing. It's just the issue of that understanding of that 72 hours and for how long that this COVID-19 test is valid for. On the South African side, perfect understanding. But thank you very much for clarifying. Now, let's come back to the other part of international travel. You've said we're not seeing big numbers, but when it comes to airports, what's the situation there? What's been the feedback over the last 2 weeks? Are we seeing the numbers coming? Because our tourism sector does need those visitors from those countries that you've explained very well last week that can come to South Africa.
Well, Dan, you see, our problem is, to be honest with you, in this, you know, the strategy we are following is to balance life and livelihoods. And that's why we are doing this risk-based approach. And unfortunately, the problem is that the countries that have got the highest volumes of people who come as tourists happen to be the countries with the highest incidence of infection. I mean, like the UK, the US, those are our biggest markets. But you are aware that they are very high up there. And so remember that in terms of the regulations, we are not allowing leisure travelers from those countries because of the volumes that we'll get and we'll lose and get into a second surge, which we know we are trying to avoid. So we are only allowing from those high volume countries, we are only allowing people who are coming for business, people who are coming as investors, people who are bringing rare skills, and people who are on international missions of sports, arts, and culture. So the ordinary leisure traveler is not allowed. And of course, we must accept that's where the volumes are lying. So that's the weakness that we're having.
Now, Minister, in your statement the other day, you said you'll review these high-risk countries like the UK, the US, the United Arab Emirates, Switzerland, that were listed, the likes of Oman and Qatar, on a fortnightly basis. Is that happening currently? Are they still listed?
Yes, they are still listed. The review happens like this. Net joints officials sit together with all the other statistical bodies like Stats SA, etc., and they sit together in net joints and they analyze all the figures, even from the World Organization, from other countries and other international bodies, and they give this recommendation to to the national command structure, which must then decide on whether the list has been reviewed or not. So that's how the review is going to take place. And indeed, yes, in the regulations, we said that review will happen every 2 weeks. It has not yet, in other words, they've not yet brought it in front of the NCC. Anyway, the NCC is sitting sometimes this week. Maybe it will come in front of them.
Okay, and the numbers of the visa-free countries, you announced an increase in those numbers. Should we anticipate there'll be more such numbers of more countries rather being allowed in visa-free?
Well, then let me explain what happened, because I realize it confused people when we mention about visa-free countries. There were countries that were coming to South Africa visa-free before COVID-19. I increased their number by 7 during my budget speech last year. So those countries were visa-free even before COVID-19. But when COVID-19 struck, most of them, like the UK, the USA, South Korea, etc., you'll remember that they were the ones who were the hardest hit, and every country was afraid of infection being imported from them. So we took away their visa-free status so that we could control who comes in. Because without, if you have got a visa-free status, you just take your bags and go. But if you have to apply for a visa, we'll definitely know how many people are coming and at what time, etc., etc. So that's why then we reimposed the visa. Now, what we did last week was just to reinstate their visa-free status. So they were not really new. It was countries that were having a visa-free status, but they lost it when the lockdown started. So we're just reinstating it, which means this. Germany, I'm just giving an example. Germany were UK were in that category before COVID-19. They were visa-free into South Africa. And both of them lost that visa-free status when the lockdown started. Last week, when I gave them back their visa-free, I restated their visa-free status. It means people in Germany can just pack their bags, anybody, and come in. UK, while they've got back their visa-free status, they are still subjected to this COVID-19 because they are now they are on the list of high-risk countries. Germany is not on that list. So for them, reinstating their visa-free status has opened almost everything with no problems. In the UK, it has opened, but a little bit, because they are still bogged down by the fact that they are a high-risk country. And so they still have to follow the COVID regulations of high-risk countries, which means no leisure travelers from that country.
Okay,
that's exactly what it meant.
Okay, thanks for clarifying, Minister. Now, Dr. Motsoaledi, finally, is there any measure of flexibility at a port of entry and somebody has to travel? Okay, they've got their COVID-19 test and suddenly they realize they might need some other document. What would your message be? Because we have to adhere strictly to the COVID-19 regulations under level 1. But is there a measure of flexibility that your department has afforded the Ports Authority, the immigration officials at the port of entry, especially around our regional borders?
Yes, definitely. There is a lot of flexibility. For instance, we have asked our port managers, if people, for instance, arrive there without having applied because maybe they didn't know or whatever reason they give, they are allowed to apply there at the borders, and we are able to handle the application urgently. So we have done that. Secondly, you may be aware that last week there was an announcement of a test, what you call an antigen test that can be done at the border. If you don't come with a 72-hour certificate, you can do that antigen test at the border, and it's only about 15 minutes. So we have put all those concessions in trying to facilitate movement between our countries.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister of Home Affairs.